r/askreddit CPS workers of Reddit, what was the worst case you have seen? It was one of the first cases I investigated, but it involved a child death. There was actually another worker assigned to take the priority 1 cases that day, but she was stuck out in the Bowenes working another emergency when we got the call. A 2-year-old child had been brought to the emergency room by her mother. The child was cold and blue, and she had a living sister, age 3 yo. I had just been cleared to take P1S and my unit supervisor sent me to start working the case. She also called the region to send us a special investigator, a CPS investigator with police or military experience. They have special privileges in their work. By the time we got the report, police were already questioning the mother. It was my first time to witness a police interrogation. The mother refused to speak English during the interview, and she had her friend translate for us. For some reason there wasn't a Spanish to English translator brought for the interrogation. Anyway, the mom claimed the child had been jumping on the bed with her sister when she fell off the bed and hit her head on the floor. She was vomiting later in the evening, and when the mom checked in on her the next day, the child was dead. Super sketchy as preliminary reports showed no head injuries. We went to the house to investigate the scene with the police, and the mom and everything had been stripped bare, all the furniture and family possessions gone. It smelled strongly of bleach. It was the first time I had a close look of the mom, and she had bruising on her neck, a huge and fresh bruise under her chin, and her eye was swollen. She claimed she slipped and hit her chin on the kitchen counter. Anyway, in the following days, we learned the truth. A year prior, CPS investigated the family when it came out that mom's boyfriend was abusing the children, pulling their hair out, slapping them, etc. The department required the mom to end her relationship with the boyfriend, which she did, and provided therapeutic services for the family. But a few months after CPS left, the boyfriend came back to the home. The night of the 2-year-old's death, she messed her pants while the boyfriend was watching a sports game. He got angry and kicked her in the stomach. But he kicked her in the stomach so hard, it almost lacerated her liver in 2. The mom was correct in that the child had been vomiting and sick the night before her death. This child spent her last hours on earth suffering a painful death. The mom had waited so long to take the little girl to the hospital because she wanted to give the boyfriend lead time to escape. He ended up going to Mexico, where he was later found, brought back and charged for his crime. Both he and the mom are now in prison. The little girl's big sister was reunited with their bio father, who had been spending the past few years trying to find the girls. He was inconsolable with the news. It was, by far, the worst case I have ever worked. Child death cases always are. As an employee with CPS, your job is to protect children, and when you work a case with a dead child, you feel so useless, so helpless. Hi, I know you were watching this, so I won't take much of your time. I post every day and I'm trying to get to 1,000 subs. A sub would be massively appreciated. If you like this video, please consider giving it a like. Also, I heart all comments. Thanks. I got a good one. Well, not good. You know what I mean. Back in my mid-late 20s, I worked as a CPS agent. Specifically, I was the type to be sent to scope out living areas to see if it was suitable for the child. I think the worst living situation I've seen was this. So, I get called to this place. The report states that the house this family is living in isn't suitable for the child. It's pretty vague, as they tend to be on my end, so I go to the place. It's a really small house in middle of nowhere, Texas. This house looked like it had been abandoned for the last 100 years. It was essentially just the husk of a house. Rotting wood, barely stable. There isn't really a front door or front wall, so I'll let myself in. I'm really confused because there's no way anyone could live here. There's no cars, no signs of life. I decide to walk around the outside of the house to make sure. In the distance, I can see something that doesn't look like it belongs in a Texas desert. I walk towards it, a good mile away. I get closer and notice that it's a tent. Actually, it's 3 tents all next to each other. Shitty tents at that. There's a bicycle leaned against one of them that's missing a wheel. There's trash everywhere. Mostly beer cans and cigarette butts. There's also plenty of food wrappers, hypodermic needles and what appears to be used toilet paper. The area smells atrocious. I approach the front of the biggest tent and can hear people's voices coming from it. The voices have thick southern accents and they sound weak for lack of a better word. I can only make out two distinct voices. They both sound like adults. I stand in front of the tent and just say hello. Anybody home? I understandably scared them because I hear what the fuck come from the inside of the tent. A very skinny looking man, likely in his late 20s, unzips the tent. He is completely naked and is holding a small, beat up kitchen knife. He looks high out of his mind. He asks very politely, "Who the fuck are you?" From inside the tent, I can see that there is a woman crouched in the corner of the tent, also high out of her mind. I couldn't even tell if she was fully conscious, but the baby she was nursing certainly was. I said, "Hello, my name is Agent, name, and I work with City Youth Protection Services. I've been called here about a poor living situation regarding children. Sir, do you have any children here with you?" I'm extremely scared at this point. I'm in the middle of the desert, and the only item of self-defense I have is a taser. I try to keep my composure though. He lowers his knife and steps out of the tent. Still completely naked. He said, "Fuck man, thought you were here with the government here to take my kids and guns away. I'll give you a tour of the place if you want." I'm dumbfounded at this point, but I follow him as he walks over to unzip one of the other tents. Inside I see two children. One is unresponsive, laying face down in the corner of the tent, looks to be around 5 to 6 years old. The other one looks to be around 8 to 9 and is laying in the other corner playing with a tape Walkman without a tape or headphones in it. These were obsolete even back when this happened. I asked him if it was okay to ask his kids a few questions. He said they don't talk much, but sure. I poked my head into the tent and asked the kid playing with the Walkman and ask, "Hey, what's your name?" He doesn't answer. I ask his assumed father if it's alright if I tap him on the shoulder to get his attention. He said sure, so I did. The kid looked at me with a blank expression on his face. I can immediately tell that this kid has severe developmental problems. I ask, "Hey friend, what's your name?" He doesn't respond. I then tap the other kid who's laying face down on a blanket. He turned over and his face was completely covered in bruises. Looked like he straight up went through a fight club. I asked him what his name was. He said Devin. I asked him where all of the bruises came from. He looked at his dad, then went back to going face down into the blanket and started sobbing. I couldn't get his attention anymore. I stood up from the tent and looked at the father. I asked him what was in the other tent. We started walking over to it. As we did, I noticed this horrible smell coming from it. He unzipped it, and I saw a girl. Couldn't have been older than 4. There is a corner of the tent that is lower than the rest of it. It is full of urine. Like, to ground level, just full of urine. She's in the corner of the tent playing with some dolls. I stand up, tell the man that I'll be right back, just have to grab something from my car. I return to my car and call the local police. I tell them that who I am and what the situation is. They asked if I felt safe stalling until the police showed up. I said yes. I talked to the father about not much in particular. I asked him why he thought the government was coming for his kids and guns. He went on this long incoherent rant about however, since he moved here, he feared that he was going to lose his guns. I asked him where he kept the guns. He said he kept them under the floorboards in the rotting house. Around this time, the police showed up. 3 patrol cars full of cops drove out to the tents. The man didn't even turn around or notice until one of the officers told us to put our hands up and drop to our knees. They get processed. The kids get put in foster care. As it turns out, the couple were biological siblings and heavy meth/heroin/crack users. I didn't work in CPS, but I did work closely with CPS. I worked for a non-profit emergency shelter for children who had been abandoned, neglected, or abused. Mind you, I worked at this shelter 10 plus years ago, so the details are a bit fuzzy. I get a call one night, worked graveyard, about 2 male sibling group coming in. They had been found and picked up at Motel Drive. The oldest is 11 and the other is 9. I start reading their case file and there's a long abuse/neglect history. After being with us a few days, the 11-year-old is showing increased signs of PTSD, hypervigilance, paranoid, aggressive. he ends up pulling a knife on another one of the kids in the shelter because they came up from behind and grabbed him. Apparently, the mom, who was a heroin user, was prostituting the 11-year-old out to Johns so she could get money/heroin. He would stay awake all night in the motel while she was out of it on heroin to make sure none of the Johns came back to hurt her or his younger brother. By the time the kid turned 12, he had been expelled from 3 different elementary schools and was banned from that particular school district. Eventually, mom lost custody, and the last I heard is they were placed in foster care. Not CPS, but I worked in partnership with them. In all of these cases, CPS workers were on my side and their leadership was against them. They had far too many cases to be safe. I witnessed a physical assault on a child. It was incredibly violent, and the parent could have broken the child's neck while I was watching and moving towards them. I dialed 911 and stepped between them. I was later reprimanded for putting myself at risk. If the parent was willing to do that in front of me, what were they doing when no one could see? The state did not move them into foster care because they were too old and the oldest kid could watch out for the younger. I had an 11-year-old threaten suicide and refused to safety contract. We called crisis intervention. They did not come out because if she didn't safety contract, there wasn't a bed within 8 hours or so that could take her. And if they came out, they were responsible for her. I stayed with the client for, I think, about 14 hours. I had a buyer father return to the home after prison time for raping his daughter. They had the girls follow extensive safety procedures instead of tell the parents he couldn't return. There was likely a return to the sexual abuse. The state did not want to initiate a removal because she was old enough to learn to protect herself. I had a client with birth defects because he and his mother were the product of incest. The grandfather raped his much younger sister. The mom was the result. He raped her, and my client was the result. He was following the pattern of sexually aggressive behavior and kept being returned from the facility where he was being treated right back to the family where he was being abused. It was absurd. As a side topic, if you're struggling with drug addiction and think you're still a good parent, you aren't. That's your addiction fooling you. Get your kids into therapy and let them live elsewhere until you get yourself clean. My case was slightly different from what many would think can be the worst. I had a report about an incorrigible child. Pretty normal stuff. Parents tried everything but they cannot control their child and are worried about the safety of the other children. This particular case was slightly different. The child and her 2 siblings were adopted by their grandparents. The grandparents stated that the one child, let's say her name was Ellen, was threatening to hurt her sibling and actually went as far to chase him around with a knife. Ellen was a 12-year-old at the time of this report. After further investigation and services with the family, I learned the full reason for the original adoption. When Ellen was younger, about 6, with her mother, she was being sexually abused by the mother's boyfriend. When Ellen's mother found out about the abuse, she murdered the boyfriend in front of Ellen and had Ellen help her clean up the mess. Now comes the grandparents unable to figure out why Ellen is troubled now. After talking to Ellen more, she was angry at her younger sibling for being normal as he was also present for the murder, but too young to remember. As I last keep up with the family, the grandparent and siblings left Ellen behind and moved to another state. Ellen is currently living with a foster family and is doing much better. Sorry if this is hard to read or follow, I'm writing on mobile. I can explain more later tonight if people are interested. The one that hit me the hardest was before I actually started going out on my own and was shadowing the after hours team. We got a call from a different state worker about a family who had moved to our state and we needed to follow up. The family had 6 kids and the barely 12-year-old girl in the family was a registered sex offender. At 12. It was heartbreaking. It was a blended family and the mom, who was the BO parent of the girl, believed that the girl had been exposed to porn and sex by her BO dad. Anyway, one night, one of the kids said, "Girl's name touched my penis." The parents, shocked, talked to each kid individually where they all disclosed that she had touched them. Not knowing how to handle it, they called CPS in their state for help. CPS came out, called the cops, and for reasons that weren't clear to me, the child was placed on the registry by a judge. In my experience, usually they try inpatient and other therapies before going that route, but apparently that state and judge did things differently. So, when the family moved to our state, we had to go out to make sure the family was following adequate guidelines. For example, the girl was not allowed to be alone with her siblings. She couldn't swim in the pool at the same time as her siblings. She couldn't go to school or the park or birthday parties because she was a sex offender. Her siblings couldn't have friends over. All the kids were in therapy and they appeared to harbor no ill will toward her. I think about this case a lot and I always wonder what happened to their family. Never worked for CPS or the like, but there's a kid I've wondered about for a long time. When I was pregnant with my first spawn, over a decade ago, there was a girl who often had appointments around the same time as me. She was always there with what I assume were her mother and grandmother, and if that girl was a day over 11 years old I'd be taken aback. She was so little and massively pregnant. She didn't even have breasts when I saw her, and she still wore bright, simple kid clothes and glittery shoes. I'll always wonder how the hell she ended up pregnant so young, and how life has turned out for her thus far. I worked with a girl who got pregnant at 12 by a man 8 years older than her. The man had known her since she was 8, been dating her since she was 10, and they were married when she was 16, because they were worried he was going to be deported. I knew from the start that she was a young mother, but the horrifying details of the situation came out over the months that I worked there. The absolute most terrifying part was that she was so fucking happy. She was convinced that this was the greatest way that her life could have turned out. She was ecstatic to be a young mother and bride, and overall she was one of the happiest people that I ever met. But every once in a while she would slip, and I could see how miserable she was. I felt so sorry for her and considered calling the cops multiple times, and not doing so is one of the biggest regrets I have in my life. Especially after I met the adoring husband. He had such a terrible aura around him, and the entire time he was around all I wanted to do was punch every tooth out of his terrible head. The worst part was that her parents sanctioned everything and, by her account, were totally okay with the entire situation. Not a CPS worker, but my mom was a foster parent and ran a daycare out of the home, so we've known the specifics and assisted on a number of cases. One foster case was a child that was placed with us for about a week. He was a tiny little baby, and despite being in high school I work up to feed him. The mother was a teenage pregnancy who was abandoned by her parents for said pregnancy and simply didn't know how to care for a baby. CPS was really understanding and gave her classes, and then when she learned how often a baby actually needed to be fed she got her child back. She reached out to us and thanked us for everything, and we got regular updates. Child is 2 now, very happy and loved. Another case where we called CPS, a mother brought her 4 kids to our daycare. Her oldest son and 3 daughters. Oldest son was 7 and did most of the care for his younger siblings, ranging from 2 to 5 in age. Mother was pregnant, again, when she was obviously below the poverty line. Baby was born. Her kids got progressively more and more dirty to the point my mom reached out in a Facebook group for clothing donations for the kids. They'd get dropped off. She would bathe them all and dress them again. She made excuses for the mother, which she says now is her biggest regret. She just kept saying this is her 5th child and she's a single mom and a new baby. It's hard. Then we had to care for the baby. Sickly. Shitting blood. After 3 days with him my mom called CPS. We were never told what happened with them, but I remember they came to pick some things up, and I remember looking out our front window and seeing them in the worker's car all crying. It's hard, but you know it's better for them in the end. Late to contribute, but thought I would add. I'm a neurosurgeon, not a CPS worker. The case was infantile rape. The true disgust, however, is when you consider the mechanics that result in the degree of injury. A child is flexible but weak. In the effort to rape her, both hips were grossly dislocated. A child's orifices are obviously too small for such penetration, so the vagina and anus were severely torn. The penis entered the rectum at least a few times, resulting in rectal tears and colonic perforation. The vagina and cervix were torn as well, and the uterus was severely damaged. The baby, to deal with crying, may have been hit against an object, resulting in multiple rib and spinal fractures, as well as a depressed skull fracture. I have been in neurosurgery for over 10 years now, and this was the only time I let out a tear and vomited violently. The infant did not survive. I did not have the heart to follow up on the perpetrator, for I feared my reaction if I were to learn he got away, or if I did not agree with the punishment. Entering this thread is like entering a door that says do not enter. I know I'll hate reading 100% of these responses. Edit. Kids are as innocent as it gets, and for them to have to endure some of the things I've seen in this thread is unfathomable. I get it, this stuff is insightful to people who are ignorant to it. But, my god, is it painful to read some of this stuff.